Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to Watchbox, and thanks for logging on. Today we have a showdown between unconventional, precious metal, no date, vintage inspired divers. It's Tudor versus Omega versus starts now. All right, let's start with these watches in the order that they are sized. So from small to large, we're going to start with the Tudor. The Black Bay is not new. The initial version of Tudor's vintage inflected modern dive watch arrived in 2012. 4 years later, it gained in-house calibers, and for 2018, it gained a new, thinner, more historically authentic Black Bay 58 size. For 2021, we gained the version you see here, which is the Black Bay 58 18K for 18 karat yellow gold. So the watch is 39 millimeters in diameter. It is 12.8 millimeters thick, and from lug tip to lug tip, it is 47.8 millimeters with a 20 millimeter spacing in between the lugs. We're going to throw this watch on my wrist, which is 16 centimeters in circumference, and you can see it wears very nicely. Inspired by the no guard, no date Tudor and Rolex Submariners of the 1950s and early 60s. This watch is closer to the original in size than the regular 41 and 43 millimeter Black Bays. Now, of course, the timepiece is also thinner than a standard Black Bay, 12.8 millimeters. The 58 is getting close to Rolex levels of svelteness, and the timepiece wears easily underneath the cuff in spite of being a sports watch. Because it is so short across the wrist, I can recommend it for wrists as small as 13.5 centimeters circumference, more than the Seamaster 300. This is a unisex option that wears really well on a smaller wrist. Taking a look at the strap, you can see that it is high-grade alligator leather, large rectangular scale, black semi-gloss. There's a contrasting stitch in there, a little bit like an aviator's strap. It has a broad sheer cut side. You can see there's a nice contrasting binding there. On the underside, it's some more conventional calfskin, and the buckle matches the case. So you have this 18 karat yellow gold buckle, and it is properly hallmarked to match a case in yellow gold. Now, what I like about this is that in this day and age, you don't always read a watch like this as precious metal. It actually looks a lot like the bronze timepieces that have been all the rage. Now, the timepiece is yellow gold, and a pale yellow gold, which makes it both bronzy and a little bit vintage inflected, as yellow gold on a sports watch isn't the most common combination these days, and it's paired with a beautiful olive green dial and olive green anodized aluminum bezel insert. Now, we'll get close again. You can see one of the quirks of these in-house caliber Black Bays. They have the pre-1968 Tudor Rose logo on the crown, and then the post 1968 Tudor Shield logo on the dial, and they actually switched over mid-1968. We've got a snowflake-inspired dial. So this dial is inspired by the Tudor Submariners of the late 60s through mid-70s. So the case design and the dial design actually stem from two different eras. We have a vintage chaptering style track for reading the seconds and the minutes, and then a flourish that vintage watches would not have enjoyed, applique metal hour indices. Now, the bezel is a 60-click type, but it has a weighty feel to it and what feels like a relatively broad, long engaging click. So it doesn't snick, snick, snick. It goes snook, snook, snook. It's a much more refined, I would even say somewhat heavy, and one might even say rich, almost quality exuding type of feel. It's not the micro detents of a Rolex bezel. It's something bigger, something more substantial. Now, the watch has a movement inside that frankly is not necessarily the most pleasing to the eye. As you can see, the movement is a Tudor Kinesi piece. Kinesi, the name of the Tudor venture that produces this movement. You'll also find it in various Breitling and Chanel products, but it started in Tudor. What makes the most appealing aspect of this movement is that it was designed specifically for the case. Tudor has a different sized version of its in-house caliber, or its Kinesi caliber, for the 43, 41, and 39 millimeter Black Bays. And so this right here is a movement created specifically for the Black Bay 58. It is the MT5400 automatic winding 70-hour power reserve. It has stop seconds, an anti-magnetic silicon hairspring. It has a full balance bridge with a free sprung index and a rotor bearing, all those features making it more shock tolerant. A COSC certified Swiss chronometer, water resistant down to 200 meters. We've got a screw down crown. Now, what I like here is the size. Unlike a standard MT5602 like you might find in a conventional Black Bay. The 5400 has a smaller diameter at 26 millimeters versus 31.8, and it's 4.99 millimeters thick instead of 6.5 for a standard 5600 series. So they did create a movement that has the same tech specs, but it is much smaller to properly fit the case. Now, I will say this, I don't need to see it. I'd rather have a solid gold case back than this roughly 20 Swiss franc sapphire over a movement that is quite frankly industrial. I'd go with a solid case back on this watch and give it a cool design rather than open up the view to a movement that's just not attractive. So that is the Black Bay 58. Now, in terms of what you're going to pay new, $16,825. This is by far the most expensive Black Bay variant. Pre-owned, it doesn't lose a whole lot of value, but unlike contemporary Rolex watches, it does lose some. It's going to be $13,950. So let's talk about the Seamaster 300. Now, this is not the first generation Seamaster 300. That came out in 2014, and it was a little bit more modern than the second generation watch, which came out last year. This is the 2021 second generation Seamaster 300, and unlike the Tudor, which references a bunch of different Submariner references, this pretty specifically references the original CK2913 of 1957. So the watch is 41 millimeters in what's called bronze gold. This is the Seamaster 300 bronze gold, a new model for 2021 and a new material for Omega. The watch is 41 millimeters in diameter, 14.8 millimeters thick from lug tip to lug tip, 48.2 millimeters with a broader 21 millimeter spacing between the lugs. So while this watch is a little bit more true to the shape and detailing of a vintage watch, it's also considerably larger than its historical forebears. The watch uses what's called bronze gold. It's a combination of bronze, palladium, copper, and gold that has a rose color. To get a sense of the difference between the two, you can see this is a much darker, warmer rose tint, whereas this is much more yellow. It is technically 9 karat hallmarked, and per Omega it is 37.5% precious metal or gold. So, taking a quick look at the watch, you can see on the wrist, it's much larger than the Tudor. It's thicker by 2 millimeters. It's only fractionally broader across the wrist, though it seems like more, because the lugs don't taper down as they do on the Tudor. And of course, as a 41 instead of a 39, it does look bigger. It's got more wrist presence. If you have a big wrist, this is going to be the hands-down choice. If you've got a smaller wrist or you're a lady, you're probably going to want to opt for the Tudor. It still has weight to it. If you're wondering, does it feel like a precious metal watch? Yes, it does feel like a precious metal watch. And whereas I felt the Tudor looked a little bit like bronze, this really does look more like rose gold than bronze, even though bronze is an actual component of the alloy. Now, taking a look at the strap, you can see here, the strap is not of the same quality as you'll find on the Tudor. It's calf skin, which costs less money. It's a little bit thinner, and it doesn't have the pleasing contrasting stitch all the way down. Neither one of these straps can be used for swimming, but this one certainly costs less money to obtain. You can see that the buckle is a special piece. It's got a combination of media blasting on its top. Then you can see the Omega logo as well as the bevels are polished. Then on its flank it's satinated. So very quietly, Omega has triple finished the buckle. And as you can see, it too here, AU 375, so 37.5 gold. This material is the same as the case. The case is simple. You'll recognize it from the pre-lyre style lug Seamaster. So this is your late 1950s Seamaster Generation 1 aesthetic. Now, I'm not going to go over all the differences between this generation of the Seamaster 300 and the previous generation watch from 2014. This watch has a larger dial, a thinner bezel. It has a dial with fewer pieces of advertising on it, all of the notes about what's inside the watch, coaxial master chronometer, all of that stuff. It moves from the dial on the first generation Seamaster 300 to the case back here. We also have these Open 6, Open 9 fonts used, and the dial has a much more pronounced sandwich style construction with a stencil on top of a loomed disc. So you can see that the numerals as well as the indices actually have height above that loomed dial base. Now, while the standard version of this watch in steel does feature a lollipop seconds hand, here the bronze gold model has a arrow index, and whereas the steel one has an anodized aluminum insert for its bezel like the Tudor Black Bay does, the bronze gold version of this watch features a ceramic insert within its bezel. And you're probably wondering, Lume shot, how do they compare? Well, let's do that right now before we jump to the movement in the Seamaster 300. In my opinion, especially after it's had a few moments to fade. The Tudor is easier to read. That said, Omega does give you a bezel pearl and a minute hand that are different colors from the rest of the dial, so you can judge them at a glance from each other. Also, Omega gives you a fully luminescent bezel, so the bezel has a ceramic insert. You could see the entirety, not just the pearl of the bezel, gets loomed at Omega. So you're going to have to choose which one of these you prefer. To my eye, especially after it's had 15-30 minutes to dim, and they always do, I think the Tudor is more visible, but the Omega certainly is more unique. Now, let's talk a bit about what lies within. Here's the case back of the Kinesi Tudor caliber, and here is the Omega caliber 8912. This is a much more attractive movement in every way. Both of them are finished by machines, but Omega actually gives you something worth seeing. We have blackened screws, we have polished screws, we have this lovely spiral arabesque Côte de Genève, as Omega calls it. The bevels, though machine cut, are attractive and bright, and as you can see, the movement does a better job of filling the case back than the movement of the Tudor does. So the timepiece has interesting tech specs. It is going to have a 60-hour power reserve via 2 barrels. So while the Tudor does have 10 extra hours power reserve, the Omega doesn't have the big balance amplitude drop-off after 24 hours that comes with a single barrel movement. So advantage on that front. Like the Tudor, it's got a full balance bridge, a free sprung index, and a silicone hairspring, very anti-magnetic. It has a coaxial escapement, which you can actually see. There's a little bridge for the coax escape wheel, and it is a direct and indirect impulse tangential contact escapement created by George Daniels and adopted by Omega in 1999. It creates a watch with improved power reserve, reduced maintenance needs, and improved precision, and the watch does have that. Another important technical feature that comes with this movement, both of them have hacking seconds, but only the Omega has an hour hand that you can move independently, and you note the watch keeps ticking, so that's a wonderful feature. The bezel here doesn't have that lugubrious feel of the Tudor. Remember I said the Tudor feels almost like it's a lush, lazy Cadillac of a bezel? Almost like there's something damping the feel between the detent and your fingers. Here, instead of a 60-click bezel, we get 120 clicks. It's louder and sharper and more mechanical, and frankly, I prefer it to the Tudor. All right. Now, we've seen the 2 watches. By the way, this one is a master chronometer, which is all the same timing standards as this one, but it's tested as a full watch in 6 positions. And the master chronometer test also includes winding efficiency, power reserve, shock resistance, anti-magnetism, and water resistance. This one's 200, this one's 300. So let's move to their individual advantages. With the Tudor, you've got a watch with a better fit, smaller diameter, thinner watch, shorter across the wrist by a small margin. So for fit, on a smaller wrist or those with a taste for smaller watches, or on a lady's wrist, this is going to be your choice. Power reserve, this is 70, this is 60. 10 hours when you're talking about these power reserve durations, 10 hours is a big difference. This watch is less retro, and that might seem like a strange thing to say when the case is like 7922 and then the dial is Tudor Snowflake sub. But the bottom line is that, to be perfectly honest, this watch is a pastiche of several different Tudor subs, and then it has the au courant use of olive green on the bezel and the dial, which makes it feel very modern. Whereas this actually became more historically true in the changeover from the first generation Seamaster 300 to the second. This really does look like a bigger modern reissue of the CK2913. So I actually like the less retro design conceit of the Tudor. I also know, and this is indisputable, that a leather strap made of gator with a contrasting stitch is of a higher quality than a calfskin strap without. So this is a more expensive and upscale strap worthy of the price premium of this watch. You may disagree, but I think the loom of the Tudor is better. For all the nuance and extra features you get with the Seamaster 300, after about 30 minutes, there is no question which of the two is better loomed. It's going to be the Tudor, even if the Omega is admittedly more interesting in the first few seconds after the lights go out. So let's talk about the advantages of the Omega. Price, new or used. So this watch is $16,825 new. Pre-owned, it's going to be about $13,900 to $14,000. So you're going to pay more for this either way. And notably, you're going to lose a few $1,000s immediately if you buy this watch new. Now, this watch new costs $11,600. Let's get close hauled again. And if you buy it pre-owned, you're going to pay between about $10,800 and $11,000. So you're only out a few $100 in the jump from new watch to used watch with the Omega, and the price, either new or used, is going to be lower than the equivalent for the Tudor. Also, it has a handsome caliber that better fills the case back, and that by a large margin. The Tudor movement is finished like something you would expect from Miyota or an entry-level Seiko. It's just not attractive. Whereas the Omega, though equally machine finished, they clearly thought about how this movement looked, and they made it worthy of a display caseback. I don't want a solid caseback here. I'm actually content to look at the movement because it's interesting and it's attractive. Also, I have that time zone function. If I am a traveler, it's going to be very easy for me to jump between time zones without disrupting my minute or my second, so I like that. The bezel feels better, sounds better. It has 120 versus 60 clicks, which makes it more precise, and it has a ceramic insert that's fully loomed versus the loomed bezel pearl and anodized aluminum on the Tudor, so advantage Omega. And because we're keeping track and we're counting every advantage, this is 200 meters, this is 300, so theoretically advantage Omega, even if you may never test their limits. Which one do I prefer? Very simple. Since they now both have a 5-year warranty, I would choose the Tudor. Though it is far more expensive, it's also far more exclusive. This is probably going to be one of the rarest modern Tudor watches, precisely because it is so expensive. So while you may lose some money up front when you buy it today, I think the long-term collector prospects are far more interesting than with the Omega. So you've got exclusivity on its side, it's got fit on its side, it's got better loom duration, in my opinion. It has 10 hours more power reserve, which is always nice. Aesthetically, I just like the proportions. It's slim, it's gloriously tapered. The lugs almost come to a point. You've got that wonderful vintage-inspired bevel. The satin is attractive. There's not a lick of high polish on this watch, which I love. And then you've got that olive green on yellow gold. It is absolutely ravishing. Add the higher quality strap, and it's easy to see why the Tudor is my favorite. It has intangibles, it has fit, it has rarity, some tech specs are in its favor, and it has a look like nothing else. Okay, I want to know which of these two you thought was the best. Which one would you take home if price is a consideration, and if price is not a consideration? Tell me in the comment threads below. Time out, Tim out. Thanks for logging on.